This is Sarah Brings with Professor Podcast, the podcast of your professors, their research, and their academic lives here at St. Thomas. This week, we are delighted to have Dr. Alexis Easley, Chair of the Communications and English Department here at St. Thomas. Welcome, Dr. Easley.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I believe this is your third time on the podcast.
It is. I'm honored to participate again.
Well, welcome back. Could you begin by giving us a synopsis of your academic background and how that eventually led you to today's topic, which is Fanny Kemble?
So I'll start back when I was an undergraduate, and I had a best friend who I admired in every way. I wanted to be just like her. And she always had these really thick novels that she was reading, just like 700 or 800 pages long. And one day I said, "What are you reading?" She said, "It's Victorian literature. You should try it." And then I was hooked from then on. There's nothing else I wanted to read. They're so immersive and so enchanting. So from there, I went on to get my master's and PhD, and I've just never fallen out of love since with the subject. My specific interest is women writers because for many, many years, everybody just studied male writers of the 19th century with a few female exceptions. Like the Brontes or,
of course,
George Eliot. So I really wanted to bring the stories of forgotten women writers to life. So Fanny Kemble is one of those writers that I'm just absolutely passionate about, having discovered her fairly recently and realizing that in her day she was a massive celebrity. And I think her story has so much to tell us about celebrity culture in our own time.
I would have to agree with that. Could you tell us a little bit about how you discovered Fanny Kemble?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a strange story, but I was in London at the Carlyle House. Thomas and Jane Carlyle were big Victorian celebrities and philosophers, and so I visited their home, and Jane Carlyle had this screen that she pasted all these images of celebrities on because it was just a hobby of hers. And I remembered fairly recently, a couple years ago, that one of the main celebrities she featured was Fanny Kemble, this portrait of her that was wildly popular in the 1830s. And obviously Jane Carlyle was just entranced by her. And a lot of the other people on the screen were feminists. And I speculate that Jane Carlyle was really interested in that history too, just like I am. She's really interested in these forgotten women and really bringing their stories to light. So ever since I saw that portrait, that was what really got me interested in delving into her story and discovering who she was as a writer and as a public personality.
Yeah, when I was researching for this podcast, I noticed that she was so prevalent in the media, especially at the beginning of her career.
Yes. Well, her story is interesting because she started out wanting to be a writer. I mean, that was her goal. And it makes sense because there were so many women writing during this time period, which most people don't realize. In fact, in 1780, 50% of the novels that were produced were by women. So she had a model of being engaged with the written word. And there were two major poets that came right before her, Letitia Landon and Felicia Hemans. And I think she must have been inspired by them because they were massive celebrities and their portraits, their poetry was just everywhere in culture. So I think she probably wanted to be just like them. As it turns out, she was a member of a theatrical family, however, and they had other plans for Fanny Kemble. They were really low on money. They owned a theater called Covent Garden Theater, and it was about ready to go bankrupt. So the only solution was to put young Fanny at age 19 on the stage. She didn't want to do it, but it was the only way to save the family from ruin. So she did it, and in 1829, she became the it girl of 19th century culture. Everyone knew her name. Everybody was writing about her. One critic called her the meteor of the hour. I mean, she was meteoric. And there was one of her fans was Sir Thomas Lawrence, who was a family friend and a very famous portrait artist. So he started sending her letters, giving her critiques on her performances of Shakespeare's plays on the stage. And then the mother got wind of this, and she said, "Well, will you create a portrait of Fanny?" and he agreed to do it. I think he fell in love with her a little bit while he was doing it.
Sure.
And so produced this iconic portrait of her that then went viral. It was printed and sold at a stationery store.
Wow.
Jane Carlisle picked it up later, but in 1829, a lot of people were collecting it. And Fanny just famously wrote that she met a man who had a neckerchief on, around his neck. And she thought it had little flowers on it, but on closer inspection, she realized that there was like little violet versions of her portrait.
Oh my
like
goodness.
all over it.
She was everywhere.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so in the media, as a celebrity at the time, in the Victorian era, do you know how she felt being that much in the spotlight at such a young age?
She claimed to hate acting and couldn't wait to stop performing on the stage. But I always take that with a grain of salt, because I think that as a woman during this time period, you couldn't claim to love, being in the public eye. To do so would be to kind of break all sorts of social rules. So I speculate she did like being an actress, but nonetheless, she didn't do it for very long. Spent about a year in the provinces doing repertory plays, and then she went to America because her father thought they could make lots of money. And she was just as popular when she got to America, largely because they knew about the press coverage in London, but also because they had their own very rich celebrity culture around the theater in places like Boston and New York and Philadelphia.
I see. And with the media between the US and the UK, it seems to me that in the Victorian era, they shared a lot of things, especially Britain coming to the US. I mean, we have Victorian homes, which is a design originated in Britain, here in St. Paul on Summit Avenue. So was she received just as well as she was in the UK as the US because of that media presence? Was that really the main driving force in the launch of her global career?
Yeah, absolutely. They didn't have copyright law between the U.S. and Britain at all.
Oh.
So any American newspaper could just cut and paste material from British papers, which they often did because it was cheaper, right?
Wow.
Sort of like now people poach, things in
Yes.
social media and just repost. It was the same idea. It was a way to have free content. So it worked both directions. So she would have reviews in the London papers that would be cut and pasted into New York papers and vice versa. So there was this constant exchange of information. And steam was invented in 1765, and came into large use. So the time for things to get back and forth across the Atlantic was shortened to about 2 weeks. So it could be timely, too. You could get news very quickly from one place to the other. And Fanny Kemble was really good at working the media. She knew just how to seize the attention of critics on both sides of the Atlantic. And she could write, she'd write to the excerpt. She knew how to write a poem, how to write a short piece that she knew would be provocative and that people would want to reprint, and therefore, go viral and make her the very famous it girl that she became.
Much like the modern day celebrity.
Yes.
I think those same methods to gain attention are used almost among everyone today. There's people who launch their careers just through social media. Mm-hmm. They don't even have to be or have the same global influence as Fanny Kemble, of course, when she was in the theater circle and she was from the famous theater family. You can purely start your career on social media, which is interesting. And it seems to be a pattern that also happened in the Victorian era with the new transatlantic press, did you call it in one of your talks?
Yeah, and she was well aware of the system, just like a Kardashian would be today,
Yes.
and kind of just what it would take to get the kind of media attention that would ensure that she continued to be the star of the stage on both sides of the Atlantic. So she was really good at that. And just to give you one example of this, in 1835, after she got married and left the stage, at least temporarily, she published her journal, which she had written from the time she set sail from London in 1829 to when she got married in 1834. And in there, oh boy, she just said all sorts of scandalous things about American culture. She was critical of the women's fashion, American men and their spitting habits, was something she really objected to. Of course, she was an abolitionist, so she, had a lot of things to say about the institution of slavery and about treatment of Native American people. So there was all kinds of content in this journal that went absolutely viral. And she became kind of a very much a scandalous person in America after that. And there were all sorts of parodies of her. But I speculate that infamy was just as useful to her as fame was.
And did she, after her acting career fizzled out because of her marriage, did she stay popular in the U.S. when she started voicing her opinions on slavery and social issues or the behaviors of Americans at the time that weren't the same in the U.K.?
Yeah, I mean, after the journal was published in 1835, I mean, everybody knew her name. Now, not for her stage performances, but rather for her anti-American, opinions. And then, once she moved to a Georgia plantation with her husband, Pierce Butler, 1838, she started another journal, which was about her experience there. And she was absolutely appalled by the institution of slavery that her husband's family was part of. But she wasn't able to publish that journal until 1863 because her husband objected to it so much, and she didn't divorce him until 1848. But still, it just took a while for her to be able to bring that into print. And once it did, it became a major abolitionist document, appearing as it did right in the middle of the Civil War.
Would that, you say, is one of her major influences at the time?
Yeah, I think so. And most critics today know her that way, as somebody who wrote a really important abolitionist text. But I'm much more interested in that earlier period, and just her contribution to the history of celebrity is kind of more of my interest, and not just how she was able to seize the media and how the press contributed to it, but also how fans contributed to it. Because you can't have a celebrity culture without fans, right?
No. Could you go into that a little more?
Yeah, so I mentioned the neckerchief that men wore, with little portraits of her on them. But there was also a figurine that was created in Staffordshire, which is where they did the pottery works in England. But anyway, a lot of people owned this figurine, which were usually on sale outside of theaters so that you could have something to take away with you when you left.
A souvenir.
Yeah. But I think of it as kind of a 3D printing because they always base these figurines on two-dimensional prints in the press. And then the potter would somehow figure out how to make that into a three-dimensional object that people could collect. But once she went to America, the portrait that was created by Sir Thomas Lawrence came with her, copies of it, and they were sold in stationery stores in America. And all of the young women, went crazy for what they called Fanny Kemble curls. They all wanted her hairstyle. So there were accounts of that, and also hats that matched her hats. So there were all sorts of ways that fans could get involved. Another way is by writing poetry. A lot of them wrote tributes to her that they published in the press as well. I mean, I think last count, I found at least 15 or 20 of these poems. Some of them, romantic by male admirers, other ones by women who wanted to be writers themselves and really found in her a source of inspiration.
And did that kind of popularity sustain when she left acting?
It did. So I think she finally did achieve her dream of becoming a writer, a memoirist, by publishing her journals. Later in life, when she was an elderly woman, she published 2 additional memoirs of her life. So she did become a writer, just as she always dreamed of being. And I do think she wrote in a way that she hoped would create scandal, so that her popularity would be sustained over time. Later in life, she also did a lot of one-woman shows where she performed Shakespeare monologues and so on to audiences throughout the UK. So she succeeded in keeping herself in the public eye. And then once she got divorced in 1848, in those days, divorce was a very rare and very scandalous thing to do, especially for a public person like her. And she lost custody of her 2 children. He went bankrupt later and became famous for selling 500 slaves, in the slave market when he went bankrupt. So he was kind of this negative image that she wanted to distance herself from in every way. And he was something of a philanderer too. That was partly why she decided to divorce him.
And what happened following her divorce?
Yeah, so she just lived a single life and went on stage in a limited way, wrote her memoirs, and made a living that way as well. She was in contact with her daughters. They were in America, but she was able to go back and visit them and had relationships with them throughout her life. But it was a source of real pain for her that she couldn't live with her daughters. In those days, the law was that after divorce, the husband got the children without exception. Yeah.
Wow. So as a Victorian celebrity from the beginning of her career to her end, after her divorce, when she was writing her memoirs and poems, were there social rules that she had to follow as a celebrity that kept her in line throughout her life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the tough things about being an actress during this period, even though she came from a famous theatrical family that was quite respectable, Sarah Siddons, her aunt, is still considered one of the greatest tragic actresses of all time. Okay, so they had certain respectability, but in general, acting was considered, kind of like something that proper women didn't do. In fact, I ran across a story of in her 1829 debut year, somebody after a performance hurled a slur at her, calling her a prostitute, and her father beat this person up, and it became the first of many scandals that hit the press. But you know what I mean? So it was always considered a slightly disreputable profession. So somebody like Fanny Kemble had to take great pains to make herself seem respectable.
I'm sure.
Yeah, the way she dressed, the way she traveled. She was so excited after she started making money on the stage because she had a carriage that would pick her up. She had all kinds of new dresses so she could really look the part of a respectable actress.
Was that unique among actresses at the time for women to kind of be able to be a little bit more independent because they were in that profession?
I think so. Yeah, I think even though they all tried to be respectable, by the way, in part by performing Shakespeare, that was one of the ways you could say, I'm respectable. I'm not doing some trashy melodrama, but rather the bards, work. So that was one way she did that. But yeah, I mean, the fact that she could travel, from town to town, and that's just part of her profession, was something that a lot of middle-class women couldn't do. I mean, think of somebody like Jane Austen, who is roughly her contemporary, who really didn't go anywhere. I mean, she traveled within, a few hundred miles of where she was born. She never really got to do anything. Yeah. It was so domestic. Mm-hmm. So an actress had much more mobility and the ability to perform different kinds of characters,
So in a way, her unusual career was a bit more liberating and gave her a little bit more freedom than normal women at the time, normal middle-class women, as you said.
Yeah, and she had an aunt who traveled with her in America. This is part of the way that she ensured her respectability, that she wouldn't, receive visitors or talk to people after her performances without her aunt present. And her father was there too. Weirdly, by the way, she played opposite her father in Romeo and Juliet, which I always thought would be really strange.
That is strange.
But yeah, for some reason, for 19th century viewers, that was okay.
Okay.
But anyway, her aunt died in a carriage accident. yeah, a few years into her tour of America. And so that caused a crisis too. Like, what am I going to do now? Who's going to protect my reputation? So that's when she got married.
To Pierce Butler.
Yeah.
And then when she got married, you said she moved to America. And that's where she began to form her, or did she already have these ideas preformed because slavery had been abolished in the UK years before the US?
Yeah, exactly. 1807, the slave trade was banned in the British Empire, but it wasn't until 1833 that slavery itself was outlawed. Compare that to America, 1865, at the end of the Civil War when slavery was abolished. But yeah, abolitionist discourse in bohemian circles like those she traveled in, was just considered normal, to be against slavery. And some of the strongest abolitionists were from the UK during this time period and put lots of pressure and gave lots of money to the abolitionist campaigns in America. And so she was well aware of all of that because of her family ties, and it was just part of her DNA. But when she did get to America, she, I think, very intentionally wrote about that. And it's puzzling that she would marry him, knowing that he was a slave owner, or at least his family was at that time before he inherited the plantation. But yeah, I find that puzzling, yeah.
Did she chose to marry him, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Was there push from her family or from society for that matter for her to get married at one point?
Yeah, I think for a woman of this time period, there was constant pressure. Yeah, that was what you were supposed to do no matter what. If you're on the stage, it's temporary until you find a husband and can be reintegrated into proper society that way. So I think, yeah, she experienced a lot of pressure and had offers besides his to choose from. I think he was a very charismatic individual and very handsome. So I think she was kind of carried away by all of that and was ready for a change. And I think she falsely believed that he was the kind of guy who would give her independence. But as it turns out, yeah, he was quite the opposite. When she got ready to publish her journal about her American experience in 1835, he objected strongly. And we don't have the manuscript, but apparently he went through and cut a lot of things that she wrote that he thought were too sensitive.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of censorship going on there. Yeah.
I'm sure, especially in the time period, a married woman having opinions like that were very controversial in the U.S., maybe even offensive to American citizens when it was published.
Absolutely.
Did she leave America because she became unpopular there, or did she leave because she didn't want to be there? What was the main reason?
She went back and forth between London and the U.S. for much of her life throughout up until through the 1840s. She was kind of going back and forth because of her girls, but also because she had two lives. She had two sets of friends, and her family she was born with was back home in England, so she was moving back and forth a lot. Eventually, she settled pretty permanently in the UK after the 1850s and 60s and 70s. But she was definitely a woman of two countries. And I think really saw herself partly as American because her daughters were born there. So, yeah.
Did most celebrities have that shared identity between the U.S. and UK, or was that unique to her?
That was pretty unique to her. Coming before her was Frances Trollope, who published Domestic Lives of the Americans in 1832. So she was the immediate predecessor to Fanny Kemble. So she traveled around, said a lot of critical things about America, too. And that might have been a source of inspiration for Fanny's own journal. And then Harriet Martineau came to America and wrote a very strong series of abolitionist pieces right after Fanny Kemble. So I'm really interested in this whole time period of women, in their engagement with abolitionism and in America.
What do you think opened the door for women to be able to start writing during that time period and have these opinions and publish them?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, print culture was expanding like crazy. I mean, paper was cheaper, you had steam printing. Books all of a sudden became a ubiquitous part of everyday life, as did newspapers and periodicals. You just had an expansion of the reading public like never before. So somebody had to write all of that material, and women were quite eager to jump in there and write for women audiences because women were reading in greater numbers than ever before, too. So it's all sorts of opportunities that were established for women that made it possible to have a career as a writer, just as careers as actresses were possible during the same time period. So that was a really great development. And then as the 19th century rolled on, you really had more and more women entering into literary culture as journalists, as novelists, as poets. So it's kind of exciting, yeah, to
Very
see that
much
happen.
so. And with that expansion of media there was and the invention of the printing press, we should have all this media from women writers. So why did they get forgotten? Why did they get left behind?
Yeah, it all has to do with the institutionalization of English studies that happened at the end of the 19th century. English wasn't studied in college until then. If you studied literature, it was classic Latin and Greek texts until the end of the 19th century. And then all of a sudden, people were interested in this thing called English literature and studying it in colleges. But they had to create a canon for people to study. And because most people who were teaching in academia were male, they chose largely male writers for undergraduates to study in college. So that's kind of how it happened. So fast forward into the 1970s and 80s, when all of a sudden people are saying, wait a minute, there are all these other really interesting writers, a lot of interesting popular male writers too, by the way, who are long forgotten, who deserve to be studied. It's such a rich and vast field. I mean, in colleges, people studied this like tiny percentage of what was published, so it really was not representative at all. And not to mention writers of color, and writers in the Anglophone reaches of the British Empire that weren't studied either. So it's been exciting to be part of this opening up during my career so that people are interested in what we call non-canonical writers.
For sure. I even noticed that in my high school that I go to, I think the only female author that I read was Charlotte Brontë. That was the only female author from the Victorian period that I ended up reading in high school, and I took 2 literature classes, and we read about 20 books between them. Right. So I think even today it's still opening up, and writers of color and female writers are becoming more prevalent in education, but not quite there yet.
Yes, I agree. And your high school experience, I think, is the perfect indication of that. I'm really sorry to hear that they didn't have more women writers, even though Charlotte Brontë is like, if you're going to pick one, she's pretty amazing. The other thing that was happening during the same time period that I just described was the unfolding of the women's movements. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women came out in 1792. And it was a manifesto, that is still really radical in terms of like demanding equal rights for women who, of course, couldn't vote until 1920, let alone own property or have custody of children and so on. So there was this very strong women's movement beginning in the 1780s. And then fast forward to suffragettes of the 1890s. Fast forward to 1970s, with the second wave feminism. So it's impossible to study the history of women writers without seeing that broader trajectory of kind of an interest in women's lives, equity in women's experience. And all women writers in one way or another commented on that, including Charlotte Brontë, who says to Rochester, I will not be chained by you,
Did Fanny Kemble, was she involved in the feminist movement as well? Did she ever write about that?
Yeah, she writes quite a bit about women's rights. And in fact, that's something that really bothered her about American culture, was how women were treated like second-class citizens. And she said she found it hard to find a lot of intellectual community there. in the circles that she was involved with. So yeah, if you read the journal, you'll see, lots of feminist commentary, even though that word feminism didn't exist until the end of the 19th century. So she would see herself more as a strong-minded woman or an advocate for the female sex. Those would be expressions she would have used.
Was Great Britain a little more advanced in women's rights like they were with abolishing slavery and the abolitionist movement? Or were they kind of on the same level as the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the intellectual energy behind the women's movement, at least in this early period, came from Britain. Somebody like Mary Wollstonecraft. But yeah, the trajectories are really quite similar in terms of suffrage and kind of lots of groups of women who are pressing for equality. Yeah, so they're really simultaneous histories in the two countries. Although if you had asked Fanny Kemble in the 1830s, she would have said that Britain was ahead in its treatment of women.
So was she also quite active in these circles that discuss social issues early on in her career when she just started as an actress, or did that kind of develop later?
She had a friend, Harriet St. Leger, and the two of them wrote letters back and forth, and they were very consciously trying to develop their mental cultivation, and to challenge each other and debate issues. And so I think that was a really important part of her education, because she went to a finishing school where she learned modern languages and how to write and basics of geography, but she couldn't go to college, then. Women's colleges weren't to come for decades and decades, right? So how do you do that? You make friends with people who are thinkers, and you have really engaged, rich conversation with them. And the correspondence between these two women is amazing. I mean, they're teenagers, but the level of intellectual engagement is so powerful. It's just, and it continued for decades, their correspondence.
Was that a common behavior for Victorian women, to grow their intellect through conversation with each other?
Yes, absolutely. If you think about it, you're kind of stuck at home a lot. If you're a middle-class woman, you're not expected to work before you get married. Yeah, basically there's working on your embroidery or playing the piano. I mean, just those home, domestic kinds of arts. So there was a lot of time, where you could plot the revolution and you could, really think through key questions and do a lot of reading, tons of reading, because you didn't have television or film. You had theater, but there was a lot of spare time. Yeah, for middle class and upper class women, that is. Yeah, different rules for working class women, who of course were at this time working 12-hour days and 6 or 7 days a week. Yeah.
And earlier we talked about that portrait that initially drew you to Fanny Kemble. And when kind of digging into her a little bit before the episode, I read that there is a very famous portrait of Queen Victoria that is based off of a Fanny Kemble portrait.
Yes. While she was in America, she met Thomas Sully, who was an American painter, very famous portrait artist. And he created an iconic portrait of her, which was actually her favorite portrait that anyone did of her as Beatrice from Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. So it features her her back turned to the viewer, but sort of looking back over her shoulder in a very enchanting kind of way. So later, after Queen Victoria was crowned Queen of England in 1837, so the Beatrice portrait was 1833. Okay, so 1837, Thomas Sully went to the UK to paint the new Queen's portrait, which was done in 1838. And it's very similar in the way that it depicts her, kind of her back to the camera, but sort of looking at the viewer in this very come hither kind of way. So both iconic portraits by an American painter. So even at the level of the iconography of the Queen, Fanny Kemble was really important, in kind of setting out a feminine ideal that would then become so mainstream, important to the government of England. So it's like that is the depth of her influence on Victorian culture.
That's so interesting. Just the reach of her influence and the fact that her essence is in a royal portrait. Wow.
And the funny thing is that most accounts of her, and I'm not sure if I should take this with a grain of salt or not, describe Fanny Kemble as not very pretty at all, which I find surprising, given...
Very surprising.
Yeah, there were, I think there were at least 30 known portraits of her, so she was one of the most painted women of her generation, and everyone went to see her on a stage. She inspired all sorts of, kind of admiration from her fans. So it was clearly more than just her appearance, but rather her charisma, that it factor that a celebrity has to have in order for people to be fascinated by them.
That's very interesting. Was that possibly because the way that people said that she wasn't attractive? Was that maybe because the idea of having a woman with a charismatic personality and an attractive personality was hard to understand or grasp at the time? Or was that simply just how she was viewed by people?
Yeah, it's a puzzling kind of question, because some of the depictions of her as being homely are after she became really infamous. So it makes you wonder if they were just kind of, it was retribution for her speaking her mind, that they would say these things about her, or if it was the truth, or she was just good at sort of performing in a way that, it seemed attractive on the stage. So I don't know. Yeah, it's whatever it was, she clearly had the ability to seize the attention of the public, whether she was beautiful or not. And to me, that is the ultimate act of self-fashioning, if you can kind of create your own celebrity that way, I mean, she was obviously talented too, but...
Multi-talented, I would say.
Multi-talented.
She would actually make the perfect modern-day celebrity. Multi-talented, prevalent in the media. Mm-hmm. She seemed to have some opinions at the time that were well-received by some, very controversial to others, much like we pressure modern celebrities to kind of speak out on certain issues or have opinions on what's going on in the current world. But I would say if she was here today, I think she would be pretty popular.
Oh, I think so too. Absolutely. One thing I forgot to tell you that she did that I was especially impressed with, and this is my own discovery from doing archival research, is that she actually wrote an essay anonymously about herself.
Oh.
That she published in a journal to kind of speak in opposition to her critics. So she talked about herself in the third person.
Really?
Like, yeah, that Fanny Kemble, yeah, she does go too far, but you know what? She's really brilliant. And anybody who criticizes her is being hypocritical, because before they said they thought she was really great. So she really was, enhancing her own celebrity by writing about her own life anonymously.
That seems so unusual.
I know. She's not the first woman writer I've discovered who did that, but still, it's pretty advanced, don't you think? And it helps that during this time period, like 99% of everything published in print or journalistic media was anonymous. So I speculate that's one of the reasons women's writing took off, is because they didn't have to be women when they wrote. They could just be anonymous, and they could write about whatever they want and say whatever they want.
I'm sure. That's very interesting that you could use that cover, that kind of shield, to further your career in a time where maybe the opinions of the public and how you're perceived by the public would solely determine your success, regardless of your talent. Well.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was definitely another reason that women could succeed so well during this time period. I mean, the stereotype is the fact that women had to assume pseudonyms was like this really bad thing. But I see it as a very good thing, because they could perform as identities that weren't restricted by gender definitions. Marianne Evans could be George Eliot, She could be a man and write as a man, and have more leeway in terms of what she could write about.
Did women usually reveal their identity at any time, or did they have to stay anonymous?
Yeah, many women, the large majority, remained anonymous throughout their careers. They never came forward and said, I wrote this, this, and this. They just, because of respectability, they wanted to have a separation between their public and private selves. Others, like George Eliot, because they became so famous, they had to out themselves. In her case, because someone was claiming to have written her books that, really offended her, But Fanny Kemble, for her, with the exception of that essay I just told you about where she writes anonymously, she was keen on attaching her name to everything, So that was another model, right, of being the named, visible celebrity. And that took a lot of bravery, which is one of the reasons I admire her so much.
To take credit for her work at the time is very brave, I would think, to put yourself in the spotlight.
Yeah, and she subjected herself to all sorts of ridicule. I mean, there were lots of parodies written about her journal after it came out in 1835, including one that I have a picture of where it's called Dear Good Little Me, and it takes her iconic Lawrence portrait and it kind of like makes it seem ridiculous. There she is, just so full of herself, so vain, according to this creator of this book, Sketches supposed to have been intended for Fanny Kemble's journal. So this was just one of many parodies of her journal that appeared. But she didn't seem to mind. I mean, I think she expected that to happen and knew that every parody would increase her visibility and therefore her media presence. So somehow she managed to survive it all with her reputation intact. Thomas Carlyle, the one I referred to earlier, whose wife created the decoupage screen, he said that in London, this is like 1836, he saw her at a party, because she was also a performance artist of sorts, in men's riding clothes. She shows up at the party, cross-dressed. So that was a part of it too, right? Performances both on the stage and off the stage meant to provoke and to get media attention.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Easley. To learn more about her work, you can find her on the St. Paul campus of the University of St. Thomas. The Professor Podcast is brought to you by the St. Thomas Libraries and made possible with the funding from the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm your host, Sarah Brings. The producers and library staff are Mary Davidson and Andrea Kepi. Thank you so much for our guests and to you, our listeners.